Implementing a pause system can be tricky, but it's a crucial component of pretty much any video game. Here's how I did it for my indie game in GameMaker. First, I'll just pause the game several times so you can see what it looks like in-game. Right now, the dark pause screen makes it hard to see what actual elements in-game are pausing. I'll disable that in a moment so you can see better. Pausing brings up this menu and pauses all sounds, all particle systems such as the rain and the fires, for example. It pauses all sprites, sequences, effects like screen shake, alarms, and time sources. A cutscene, like when dialogue appears, also pauses certain elements, but it's not quite the same as actually pausing the game. Like sounds and music aren't paused, and obviously dialogue visuals will not be paused. Now, as you see here, you can pause the game during a cutscene too. There are checks in the pause code to account for this. Because if certain elements pause from the cutscene, and then the player pauses the game, you don't want things to like double pause, if that makes sense. Also, unpausing during a cutscene is a little tricky as well. You'll see it in the code soon. Here, I pause right as the lightning strikes and the sky lights up. I'll spawn an enemy and pause a few times just to show it working. So again, all sounds and graphical elements pause, except of course for the actual pause menu and the pause sound effect. Okay, now I've turned off the dark background of the pause menu. The arrow at the top right points to the sky where the lighting will be paused. Here, the particles generated from stepping, such as the grass or water, are paused. This is me trying my best to get fancy with the editing. I'm such a noob, but I'll get better, I promise. This is probably unnecessary overkill. Moving on. I may remove this feature, but here you can see when the hero gets hit, the screen goes red briefly, and that also pauses. And here, the white flashing after hitting an enemy pauses. These enemies entering the scene are sequence assets in GameMaker. These can be paused with code too. You may have noticed the enemies were blinking during their entrance, which signifies they can't be hit by the player during that brief moment. The code I'll show you soon makes sure they are visible when pausing during this entrance sequence, because it looks weird if you pause it right at the moment they are invisible. I disabled pausing during this red kill overlay. There are several functions for pausing and unpausing in various situations. I'll just go over the regular pause code in this video. In almost all step events, begin, normal, and end, there's a line of code that checks if the game is paused and exits the code if so. The line of code also appears in a lot of the draw events for UI. Here I have some debugging code above line 31 where this exit conditional is checked. If the game is paused during the ripple effect, then the effect is just disabled, otherwise it looks like this. Oh, and lastly, pausing is disabled during a room transition. This function will resume the game by first making sure the pause sequence has finished playing through. It then sets the head direction of the sequence to play left, plays the pause sequence, and plays the pause sound effect. Now let's run through the code. First, we set a global game pause variable to true. Here, we make sure the game speed is set to 60 frames per second in case the game is paused right during a hit stop effect when hitting an enemy, where the frame rate is dropped to 5 FPS for a split second. Here, we increment any active alarms of all objects, besides a select few like the game controller object. We only do this if we aren't currently in a cutscene, because the cutscene pause logic would have already taken care of this. This function pauses all particle systems by setting automatic update to false. I'll show this code loop shortly. These lines of code disable the screen shake and ripple effect. It first stores if the screen shake is active during a pause, so it can then resume during the unpause function. This block of code stores the image speed of all objects for later use during the unpause, and freezes these objects by setting their image speed to 0. This conditional deals with pausing time sources. Later, I'll add to this or implement a loop of all the time sources for all objects like the alarms. This block of code is utilizing DS maps to store the speeds of any sprite assets in the room, for example the grass, which will be used later in the unpause function. The sprite speeds are set to 0. Here I'm getting all of the enemy entrance sequences in the room and pausing them, while also making sure the enemy sprite is visible. As mentioned previously, the enemies blink during the entrance sequence. Here I use the built-in GameMaker function to pause all audio and then play the pause sound effect. Lastly, after everything has paused, a layer is created for the pause sequence asset to be created in, which is automatically played. Now the unpause game function. This function fires after the pause sequence has finished playing backwards. First, unpausing a game will initiate a save function for certain game data, for example audio and graphical settings. Then the global game pause function is set to false. For good measure, I make sure the frame rate is 60 frames per second. This block of code first destroys the pause object manager in the pause sequence, then destroys the pause sequence. Here, all particle systems are resumed, but if the game was paused during a cutscene, the player and enemy particle systems will stay paused. If screen shake was active during a pause, then it resumes. This block of code checks all objects for the existence of the variable stored image speed, then resumes frame rate at that speed. Here, time sources are resumed. This block of code checks all paused sprite assets and resumes them based on the DS map that was created in the pause function. Next, as long as we didn't unpause during a cutscene, we resume all sequences, but only if the head position is greater than 0. If the head position is 0, the sequence wasn't playing during the pause to begin with. Lastly, we resume all audio using the built-in GameMaker function. This is the function that increments all active alarms of all objects. It's called every step of the game object controller while the game is paused. This is the function that sets the automatic update to true or false for all particle systems. This checks for 20 particle systems, but you can change that if you have less or more. And that's it for now. As the game expands, so will these functions as necessary. I've seen other game devs on YouTube do pausing differently, so it just depends on your game's needs. If you found this helpful, please like, comment, and subscribe for the YouTube algorithm. It really helps tremendously and means the world to me. Thanks, and see you next time.